Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and today we're going to continue our Clone Wars history series. We're in the second year of the war. It is 21 BBY. Now before we begin, please don't forget to subscribe down below by hitting that big red button. Hitting red buttons is naturally a stress reliever, and it's not only good for your heart, but also your soul, if you have one. In our last episode, we went to the world of Salakamai, where General Grievous just narrowly escapes being captured by Republic forces. It's another close call for the cyborg, but as usual, he ends up ahead of the clones and Jedi. Chapter 8: Coruscant Black Market Weapons Trade. The war wasn't only being fought in the Outer Rim and on the front lines. Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious had started their entire plan to take over the galaxy with the Underworld, and their connections to various gangs and crime syndicates that ran rampant across the galaxy. The good thing about criminals is when you work with them, they rarely will ask you for credentials, and they'll rarely give you a receipt, which means less of a paper trail to worry about. So a Sith Lord could stay hidden, which was a very important part of Palpatine's plan. With the start of the Clone Wars came an increase in instability and unrest across the galaxy. While the Grand Army of the Republic rushed from planet to planet to put out the various brush fires started by the Separatist forces in the Outer Rim, the Judicials tried to keep peace on the home front. The war was causing plenty of problems in the core region as well. Refugees were flooding in from the Outer Rim, and in the second year of the war at least, anti-war protests became more prevalent. Meanwhile, all sorts of criminals, opportunists, and bounty hunters were taking advantage of the instability and making their money in the margins, oftentimes exploiting the weak and desperate. One particularly problematic industry that exploded thanks to the war was the black market arms trade. The Coruscant Underworld had become increasingly bold thanks to the large amount of Separatist money flooding the streets. While the Separatist Alliance had plenty of raw resources and industrial might, Republic weapons and technology was still in high demand. Anakin and his Padawan Ahsoka Tano take a break from the front lines and venture into the depths of the planet in pursuit of a potential arms dealer who is acquiring merchandise for the Separatists. While arresting the criminal, Ahsoka has her lightsaber snatched away from her. The young Padawan is afraid to tell her master what had happened and instead tries to figure out a way to get her lightsaber back herself. She goes to her other mentor in the Jedi Order, someone she had recently been tasked with helping, Jocasta Nu, the head librarian. Master Nu might not have been the most powerful Jedi in the Order, but because of her position, she almost knew everyone in the Order. And using that knowledge, the librarian takes Ahsoka to see Master Tera Sinube. Sinube was an expert on criminal organizations operating out of the Coruscant Underworld. Upon hearing Ahsoka Tano's story, he identifies that the Padawan had been ripped off by a Petrolian, an aquatic alien species that was quite rare. Searching through the criminal database, the Master was able to pull up a photo of the pickpocket for Ahsoka to identify. His name was Banamu. And before Ahsoka can protest, Sinube volunteers to go with her to the Underworld to find the thief. I think it's amazing that Master Sinube was able to figure out who the thief was based on some very basic physical description from Ahsoka Tano. Coruscant was a massive worldwide city and had a population of well over 1 trillion sentient beings. The Coruscant Security Force was in charge of policing the world, and at least on the surface and upper levels, they maintained a strong presence. Interestingly enough, on the richer and higher levels, the Coruscant Police were mostly made up of droids. The officers were usually human, or at least humanoid. But for the most part, the droids took care of most of the policing. They did everything from providing security for officials to giving parking tickets. These droids were incorruptible and objective enforcers of the law, and when a case was questionable, they also served as a perfect witness for a crime. In those more complex cases, organic investigators would be deployed and go over the case. But strangely enough, in the lower levels of the planet, policing was mainly done by the infamous Coruscant Underworld Police, completely comprised of organic beings. Perhaps in an advanced society like Coruscant, the idea of organic beings policing other organic beings is seen as backwards and a primitive way of doing things. Although it's probably very likely that these droids were not as flexible or creative enough to deal with the various threats an officer would deal with in the Coruscant Underworld. Compared to the clean and bright blue CSF droids, the Underworld Police looked almost like shock troopers, heavily armored and wearing metal helmets and mechanized goggles. The Underworld Police looked as dystopian as their surroundings did. And despite their best efforts, the underworld of Coruscant could hardly be called a stable or even safe place to travel in. As a matter of fact, it was well known that certain levels in the Coruscant underworld were completely under the control of crime syndicates and no-go areas even for the police. The lowest levels of Coruscant were full of even more terrifying and violent things, which basically made those areas uninhabitable. So while things might feel hopeless, a Jedi like Terrace Nube had been studying the criminal underworld his entire life, and he's able to point out a few markets where this thief most likely would try to sell Ahsoka's lightsaber. The two immediately head for District G17, one of the many thousands of slums located in the Coruscant underworld. They approach a dingy-looking food stand staffed by a sketchy-looking Corran. Never trust those squiddy bastards, they're always up to no good. Ahsoka asks the Corran if he has any lightsabers to sell. In my opinion, Ahsoka is clearly acting like a narc right now, but luckily she is a teenager and she's being accompanied by an old man, so they don't really seem like police officers. And the Corran must be desperate to move the Jedi lightsaber. It clearly will attract a lot of unwanted trouble, and no one fears the Jedi more than criminal scum. But the Corran's opening price for the lightsaber is quite steep, 20,000 credits. That's enough to buy an entire land speeder. But of course, Ahsoka, as usual, doesn't have much tact and immediately reveals she's a Jedi. Luckily, that's enough to scare the Corran into revealing the location of the thief. The two Jedi track the thief to a nearby hostel. Notice all of the artificial light in the lower levels of Coruscant. It's not just there for nighttime, it's there for all the time. It's even rumored that in the deeper and more primitive parts of Coruscant, the inhabitants consider the sun and daylight a myth. Anything lower than the first few dozen layers of the Undercity didn't have a day and night cycle. Anyway, the two Jedi are able to use the Force inside the hostel to find the room where their thief is staying, but unfortunately they find that the lightsaber has already exchanged hands to an individual known as Knack Movers, a feared Trandoshan assassin. Usually illegal weapons, especially larger shipments, would eventually go through an organization known as the Black Suns. The Black Suns, like most of the criminal organizations in the galaxy, like to dabble in everything from spice to slave trafficking. But they mainly specialized in two things: providing muscle and weapons smuggling. The two businesses kind of go hand in hand. Given the specialized nature of the lightsaber, however, it makes sense that an assassin would get its hands on it. This was a special item, and most likely Knack Movers was willing to pay much more than, let's say, a Black Sun's arms merchant. Ahsoka and Master Sinube continued their search for the lightsaber and traveled to the upper side of Happy Land, one of the many districts in Coruscant. Having her lightsaber fall into the hands of an assassin or a murderer is a very troubling thought for Ahsoka, especially if bodies start turning up with cauterized wounds. But when they arrive, the Trandoshan is found dead in his apartment. A Terrellian Django jumper and her partner in crime now have possession of the lightsaber, and the chase continues. Terrellian Django jumpers were just one of many interesting species on Coruscant. These blue humanoids had extremely powerful muscles and bone structure, which allowed them to run at superhuman speeds and jump extremely long distances. They could easily rival a talented Jedi's own Force abilities. Happy Land was still technically a part of the underworld, but it had large skyscrapers, most of which reached the surface of the planet. There were huge gaps in between the buildings here, which made it a perfect place for a Django jumper to evade less gifted pursuers. At this point, the Coruscant security forces are called in as backup. They have access to an assortment of vehicles which allow them to move quickly around the underworld. This included the Panther Police Interceptor. These were kind of similar to flying cop cars from Blade Runner. They were small enough to filter through buildings and had a top speed of around 220 miles per hour. The Underworld Police also used speeder bikes like the Bark Speeder. The police use these vehicles to patrol the incredibly confusing traffic lanes of Coruscant. Although all speeders can fly using anti-grav technology, they couldn't just fly anywhere they wanted to. That would make the roads incredibly chaotic. People would die all the time. So instead, there's a very complex 3D road grid that runs at different levels and vectors. All of this was further controlled by the traffic division of the Coruscant Security Force. Fortunately, the two criminals managed to get away from the complicated grid of roads in the Undercity, but just momentarily because Master Sinube had managed to place a tracker on one of them, and they followed the criminals to a regional train station. Maglevs that ran on repulsors crisscrossed the planet, and it was one of the quickest ways and cheapest ways to disappear onto the other side of the planet. After one final chase, the thieves are caught, and Ahsoka manages to get her lightsaber back, and we finish our little tour of one of the most fascinating cities in Star Wars. Like I've always said, I wish Star Wars 1313 was never canceled, and I really do hope that the future Fallen Jedi video game or even the Mandalorian TV show will have us visit Coruscant once again. Never has there been a background as rich and ripe for discovery. So there you have it, guys. As you know, I always love it when any Star Wars property goes into Coruscant and the Undercity. This was a quick glimpse at what the Underworld was like and how the local security forces worked. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our Clone Wars history series. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.